I will say that I was incredibly impressed with Richard's team. My God, that is, I don't know that you could get better attorneys to argue than Mr. Liftick and Mr. Kirk, who argued the motion today. Meta.
Yeah, and we got to speak with them briefly afterwards. I know the community was really excited about that. I got to shake the hands of these incredible lawyers that were arguing the case for Hex and why why the case should be dismissed on a lack of jurisdiction. And I believe that there was something having to do with like fraud in how it relates to jurisdiction. Can you kind of explain what the two pieces of the puzzle were that were discussed today?
Yeah, let me go through some of these in order, like some of the arguments that were made in order, since that's the way my notes go. So as long as I can read my handwriting, we're in good shape, but that's a 50-50 proposition at best. So they did start out with personal jurisdiction. The argument was whether or not, some of the internet contacts, websites, videos that Richard made or whatever, can they establish personal jurisdiction for the purposes of a U.S. court grabbing somebody from Finland and forcing them to appear inside the United States? And that's a question that hasn't quite been answered yet. And that's what a lot of the facts today had to do with. She then went, basically interrupted and said, went into the alter ego argument that the SEC had made in its complaint, and asked them straight up, have you abandoned this argument? Because the Richard's attorneys brought it up in their motion to dismiss, and the SEC didn't respond to it. So she basically asked a very pointed question: have you abandoned the argument that the software defendants are alter egos of Richard Hart? And they didn't. The SEC attorney tried a couple of times to make it sound like they weren't giving up on it, but eventually she kept asking the same question, and eventually I believe that the transcript will show that he agreed that they're essentially giving that up, and they're no longer going to pursue Hex, Pulse, and Pulsechain as alter egos of Richard Hart, which was
And that's important because that was the part that said that software could be a defendant, which seems outrageous. My read of the judge was that she didn't like that framing either, and didn't think that would stand.
Yeah, I don't think that was going to hold up later on. I think it was smart for her to focus on that originally. The purpose behind motions in general is to try to, one side makes a whole bunch of claims, and via the motion process, you tend to limit those claims so that only some of them continue on. So if somebody makes 10 claims against you and you can move to dismiss, 5 of them, then you only have to work and prepare for 5 more at trial. So that's kind of the idea behind motions to dismiss, is that you either get the case completely or partially dismissed is your goal, and then therefore you just narrow down whatever you need to continue to work on and bring to trial. So I thought
Yeah, and
yeah, go ahead, Mike.
I was just going to say the most memorable quote that the judge had the entire time, and the hearing was about an hour and a half long or so, was the judge asked the SEC, where does the blockchain live? Quote, where
Yeah,
does the blockchain live? And this was getting at the issue of the jurisdiction, which is what the basis is of whether this can be thrown out before more arguments are made. But I'm curious if you can kind of help to explain that there were some elements of fraud that were not being considered today, and there were some elements that were. And is that how was the issue of fraud related to jurisdiction, and basically what was being included and not included in this argument, this
yeah,
meeting?
they did get into some technical aspects as to whether or not 17A1 applied, or 2 or 3. I don't really have that at the tip of my mouth, on top of my head here. I would have to go through the transcript in order to get a little bit further into it. The issue with whether or not they can successfully allege fraud against Richard has to do with whether or not they have the right to bring the case in the first place. Does the SEC have jurisdiction over Richard himself? And does the SEC have jurisdiction over the transactions at issue? So there was a lot of discussion about it wasn't fraud as to whether or not factually there was fraud, because that's not what we do here in motions to dismiss, but there was whether or not the SEC can advance the case beyond the initial pleadings and then continue to allege fraud. So the issue with respect to whether or not the SEC has jurisdiction, there's personal jurisdiction and subject matter jurisdiction. In order to achieve personal jurisdiction, the SEC needs to get Richard in front of the court by some reason, and that, like, did he do domestic transactions, whatever, or did he reach into the country, create contacts with did he target Americans? With respect to subject matter jurisdiction, the court really focused on whether or not there were domestic securities transactions involved, and that is a key thing that the SEC had to
Yes.
establish. And in order to make a claim and continue on with their fraud claims, they had to establish that they have jurisdiction over a specific transaction that took place. The SEC's argument was, hey, we had a guy in Brooklyn who says he invested in this. Well, hey, great, but that's when the court started drilling down. The question was, well, he sent money to this Pulsechain and Sacrafice address, and the court's great. Like, where does the blockchain live? Like, where did it go? Like, where was that transaction settled? And when you get into cases like they brought up, they had a conversation about Williams and Binance today. Well, there was no question that those transactions were settled on U.S. servers, right? There's no allegation that the SEC's made that any of these transactions occurred on a US based server or anything like that. So the question is, where did this guy send his money? Because as an American, you're allowed to send money overseas to and have it settle on a foreign server. That does not give any jurisdiction to, it by itself doesn't give jurisdiction to the Securities and Exchange Commission from the United States. So I like that line of questioning by
I
the judge. I thought it showed that she really was ready for this case.
Yeah, I think she had experience with one previous case that both sides were trying to relate to, the Plexicorp case. I think she was involved with that one, if I
She
was reading
was.
that correctly.
She
Um,
was.
which
I warned everybody that in a Pulsechain Law School article not too long ago that I think that the SEC was going to regret bringing up Plexcore, because the reason why they did was because this was the only case involving personal jurisdiction that the SEC has brought in front of this particular judge that I could find, where the judge ruled in favor of the SEC. But the facts of that case are so wildly different that I don't believe that it helped them, and it may have in fact hurt them, because when you distinguish, like, none of that happened here, Judge. It's really hard for the judge to go, well, I don't care that none of that same stuff happened, I'm still going to rule. No, it doesn't work that way. Like, the judge has to find something similar, or this case has to look substantially similar to another case in order for her to basically say, oh yeah, no, I can give that to you based on that. And I don't think they got anywhere near that today. I don't think the SEC got anywhere near that today.
Yeah, and this was, so just to recap, this was the one crypto case that this judge had decided in the past, that was the biggest one, at least, that she had decided in the past, and the SEC tried to use that, yeah, and her knowledge of her own case, setting a precedent, and it seemed like that their argument was weakened, in fact, because in the Plexicorp case, maybe the founder was in the U.S. or did have transactions that went through the U.S. And so to help kind of organize in real time, like what we were listening to, basically you have the jurisdiction of whoever founded something, and did the founder market it and target it at people in the United States, right? Because the U.S. federal court is trying to decide, do they have
That's
jurisdiction
right.
over Hex and over Richard and Pulsechain and Pulsex. And then part of determining jurisdiction is understanding, okay, if there were US people involved who were sending money to this thing, was any fraud occurring? But again, it has to go back to, there was a fraudulent statement made that impacted U.S. people. And then later in the case, if the case survives the motion to dismiss based on jurisdiction, then they can talk about other aspects of fraud that are not currently relevant to jurisdiction.
Yeah, I thought it
And
was
so
very, I
so
thought it was very interesting the
yeah.
way the court brought up some of that stuff with respect to the fraud. The fraud is the entire fraud claim has to do with Richard allegedly spending pulse chain funds on shit that he wanted to buy. And I thought it was very telling that the judge was like, one of her questions, was basically down the road of, well, who says he can't? Like, he delivered a product that he said he was going to deliver. That's not fraud. And he spent other money on stuff that, even if he did buy a Ferrari with it or did buy a diamond with it or whatever, like she's like, well, why can't he do that? Like, and I thought that was very telling. Like, and the SEC's only response was, well, he gave everybody the impression that their funds were going to be used to develop this blockchain, and the judge basically correctly noted, it got developed. He did it. He launched it. Like, I mean, what's your problem, essentially, right? So, I thought that was very telling. And if she's thinking along those lines, I can't imagine that's horribly bad for Richard. I just really don't. I can't, you know. I think if he had made explicit promises, like I'm going to use all this money for this purpose and this purpose only, and then he did it and he bought a diamond with it, I think he might have a problem. But if he's basically saying, you don't know where it's going, and once you give it up, you're done here. And then he launched a product he said he was going to do anyway. I'm not sure she's got enough facts from the SEC to go with them on that argument, honestly.
Yeah. She was saying, okay, SEC, you're saying that he promised he was going to do something and did it, right? And Richard's team is saying he never promised anything. And the judge says, okay, SEC, well, if he promised to do something and then he did it, that is not, alone going to be something that is fraud. Now, there's still the question of, did he live in the U.S.? No, he didn't. And then, man, how many times did they bring up the Hex conference that I put on?
Yeah, well, I mean, and I thought the timeline was very important. It was so important that the Richards attorneys showed up with one exhibit, and it was a timeline of when certain events in the Hex Pulse Chain, conferences, Pulse Chain Sacrifice, the dates that are involved in all of these things, and put it out in a timeline because the SEC intentionally jumbled the timeline to make it look like Richard did things during the, I don't know, quote unquote offering period, if there was one. And when you look at it on an actual, like, linear timeline, it's not that way. And it becomes very clear that when Richard attended, or, I think it was virtually attended, right? The Hex conference, and he spoke there. The only things he spoke about was, hey, Pulse Chain is going to have product market fix. He didn't talk about, like, buy this thing, it's going to be awesome, or whatever the hell, he was very careful and guarded with his words, and they couldn't really point to anything that said, Richard made explicit promises that we could hold him to, and therefore, they fall under the securities laws. Well, like I said, that was the only exhibit that Richard's team brought with them to this entire hearing. So, it's kind of important. They actually gave it. One of his lawyers handed it to me at the end of the hearing, and I gave it to SJ. So somebody at the Pulse Chain Tour is going to go home with that tomorrow, which I thought was pretty cool. We all signed it, so everybody was here.
And we've got that picture pinned in the Twitter Spaces here. You can go look at it for yourself.
Awesome,
We
awesome.
took a picture of the timeline in front of the courthouse. So yeah, shout out to you as being one of the people that Richard's lawyers recognized as somebody who does a great job of providing commentary.
Yeah, I got to say, I was kind of blown away because, I saw Richard's team show up in the courtroom, or in the court, basically on the floor, waiting for the court deputy to open the courtroom up. So I saw his team all huddled up down the hallway, and the 50 or 60 or so people that had been, already in the courtroom waiting on in the hallway outside the courtroom. So I went up and I recognized a couple of their guys, and I went up to Michael Ingram, and I just, he basically said, hey, just to let you know, all these people here are, in here in support of Richard, because they had, one of Patrick Smith had asked Marco, to, pack the courtroom. So we did it for him. We definitely did it for him. And, and Mr. Ingram looked at me and he said something like, "Are you nuclear herbs?" And I'm like, "Yeah," and basically told me that their team was reading my posts. And I'm like, "Holy shit!" Like that's wasn't expecting that today. So I thought that was pretty cool. Like,
Yeah, I was in shock when they like we were thanking them, Richard's team of 8 lawyers that were there, and they were just turning it back around on us and saying thank you guys for everything you do, and seem to be very aware of the community and how decentralized it is, and that because they're making the case that that Richard has not promised things that this is closer to what Bitcoin was. I know I heard that come up
yep.
once. I mean, and these lawyers that Richard had, it seemed like they were all sitting there, but there were two that were kind of appointed to be the speakers and to argue different pieces. And the same thing with the SEC. They had, well, they did not have 8 lawyers. They had
They
what,
were at 4 at the
4?
end. Yeah, only Michael Liftick, who's the guy that appeared in front of Congress a couple of weeks ago, and David Kirk were the ones who argued. And one argued jurisdiction, and the other one argued I can't remember exactly. I have in my notes, but either way, they
Fraud.
argued two different
It,
things.
it was, yeah. Was it jurisdiction and fraud?
I know that. Let me find out where ML starts in my notes, because yeah, Michael Liftick did talk about fraud. Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
And the
So, and then
chronology of the complaint. Yeah.
the SEC, like, kind of matched that with having two different people address two different things.
Yeah, and that's not uncommon that, one person will prepare for one argument, one person will prepare for another. I just think that Richard's team is about as good as you'll ever see in a courtroom. I mean, the people who went to court and watched this live were treated to something incredibly rare in the legal world. It was, first of all, it was a motion to dismiss where everybody packed the courtroom. That never ever ever happens. And B, just the quality of lawyering on Richard's side was it's something you're just not going to see because nobody's got the money to hire people that good all the time. It was just fantastic.
RG3 said that 75 people showed up, and in the main courtroom, I don't know how many people there were, but it was full. It was filled to the point where people had to join from another room as well. But yeah, the showing was extremely strong considering last time only Marco came, and this time there was actually a very hilarious moment where the SEC, in my opinion, getting desperate because they had been going in circles with the judge, and this judge was asking 2 or 3 times, sometimes a very similar question to get at where the arguments may be lacking or weak. And there was one moment where the SEC lawyer, kind of in desperation, says, like, to the judge, well, maybe we could get all the people in this courtroom to raise their hand if they're a US investor. And the judge said, no, I don't think that's necessary.
Yeah, and that was an interesting little point.
Like,
Like, I mean, if this was being held in France, you'd have a room full of French investors, right? I mean, this is just a silly argument. I know where they were trying to get at, but I kind of almost wish that she had done it because at last count, we had people confirmed from 10 different countries. I met a few of them today, like, that were in the courtroom for sure. Like,
yeah,
so I
yeah,
love
and
the
the
fact
and
that
the
people came from all over the world to see this thing.
absolutely. The judge kept asking, like, at least twice, maybe 3 times, like, well, hold on, the SEC only has 10 people that they're pointing out were affected in the US. Yeah, so that was really incredible.
Yeah, I mean, that was pointing out the deficiencies in the SEC's complaint again, which is the job. You have to allege first of all, you have to allege domestic securities transactions. Second of all, if the transactions are predominantly foreign, you can't get jurisdiction, you can't get SEC jurisdiction over them. So even if there are US investors, it doesn't end the question. It's whether or not they're predominantly foreign transactions that took place, which is, I think she understands the issue better than I probably expected her to. I think she did a lot of homework and a lot of prep for this case. And the questions that she asked were specifically directed to get the answers to the questions in her head that she had already pre-prepared for. Nothing. She didn't catch any. She didn't make up anything on the fly or go, "Oh, wait a minute. What about now?" She already knew everything that she wanted to cover before she showed up. And I thought it was incredibly important. Here's another little thing that I think some people caught, which I thought was great. When the court was talking to the SEC, and the SEC was, maybe not giving her as direct an answer as they wanted to, when she went back to Mr. Liftic said something to the effect of, "Hey, Judge, I feel like they're trying to amend the complaint in real time," which I thought was a very subtle way, very smart and very subtle way of reminding the court that the SEC is introducing new facts at hearing, which they can't do. And then the court should basically just ignore a lot of the things that the SEC just tried to bring up because they didn't bother to put them in the complaint. And the only thing we're analyzing today is the complaint. So I love the way that that Richard's team was prepared and really went at this.
Yeah, there was one like novel angle that the SEC brought in that they had never mentioned before in their writings, which particularly makes it seem weak because if it was such an important part of their argument, they should have identified it early on and immediately. But they were kind of, I think it was something about how uh, Richard had made some statement that that it was hard work creating a blockchain and it needed that basically that he was sweating getting it done and yeah, but then the judge like still comes back to but it did get
Right.
done.
Right. Yeah, I think that and I've said this before, and I talked about it a little bit when I was analyzing the pleadings a few months ago. Richard's team, if you look at it, if you take a timeline in this case and you look at what they brought up in their January letter saying, "Hey guys, we're going to bring a motion to dismiss in this case, and we're going to argue this, that, and the other thing." And then you look at what was actually filed by them in April when they filed their motion to dismiss. It basically tracks the exact same way. It doesn't change. Like they didn't change facts. They didn't change what they wanted to argue. They basically said from step one to step two, they argued the exact same thing. When the SEC responded, the SEC had things in their response that either tried to add to or mitigate it a little bit in their complaint, and I think they recognized that they had some issues that Richard's team was able to poke some holes into. But when you give it back to Richard's team for the reply brief, Richard's team didn't have to move one iota off of its original position. They were able to stay on their original position the whole time and say, we were right from the beginning. We're right now. And when they went into court today, they knew that they were right. And they just went ahead and they didn't have to budge off of their position at all either today. The SEC got, asked some tough questions and they didn't always have great answers to them, especially like when they had to abandon their, alter ego claim, when they couldn't come up with, where's the blockchain transaction settled? Where is, how many domestic investors are we talking about here? There's a lot of things that the SEC couldn't answer that Richard Hart's team was able to provide very quick, very solid, unrebuttable answers to. And I think that's a big key.
I think like a yeah, totally. And then there was this major framing that they kind of started with and continued throughout this idea of the timeline. And part of the timeline that they were establishing, also I think did made a good argument to separate hex, pulse, and pulsex. And I heard the judge basically like asking questions that might have considered how basically maybe hex it basically the timeline of what the SEC was complaining about Richard, it didn't overlap at all with hex versus maybe it did or maybe it didn't for pulse and pulsex. And in particular it was the hex conference that they were talking about, that I had put on in person, and Richard hadn't. And do you want to comment about that
Yeah, this goes
separation?
right back to the whole like the Michael or Richard's team was really hammering home the timeline on this. Like, the judge was stuck because the hex offering period, if you will. I mean, they dispute that there was an offering. I tend to go with Richard's team on this one. If they have, but like let's say that eventually there it was found to be a security. There's an offering period for the security, the adoption amplifier time frame or whatever. All of that ended well before your conference. So what the judge picked up on, and what the timeline presented by Richard's team showed was, listen, man, you can't take statements that are made well beyond an offering period and attribute them to investors, and say, well, they made a decision on their investment, based on statements that hadn't been made yet. That you can't do that. Like, I mean, you got to go by a calendar. We're still bound to those things in this world. So, and I thought that was a really important and really savvy way of bringing that point home by Richard's team, was to say, listen, you can't. The SEC just wants to jumble this all up, consider all of these products as one thing, grab jurisdiction over Richard, and then hammer him. And they were very clear that no, you have to establish jurisdiction over each individual crypto, and as well as Richard with respect to each individual crypto. And you have to show different things for different cryptos. And if you don't get one of them, that particular claim can't continue. So if the SEC didn't lay out a claim well enough for Hex to the judge's liking, then that claim could be dismissed against Richard with respect to Hex. Even if she found later on that there was enough to maybe go forward. Maybe the SEC alleged enough in the Pulsechain sacrifice or whatever. But she's going to have to do this independent analysis with respect to each individual crypto and what Richard did with respect to each individual crypto. And I thought she grasped that really well. And I thought you could tell that from her questions that she understood that very well.
Yeah, there was this individual breakdown of whether the timeline supported the SEC's case that fraud occurred with respect to jurisdiction, or that jurisdiction was a basis of launching or money being put into something. And so basically what we're saying is a takeaway, and I apologize for the background noise here, but the takeaway is that it might be possible that there would be that Hex would be dismissed from this case, and that Pulse and Pulsex would not, or that all three could get dismissed, or they all continue basically. But
Right.
that hadn't occurred to me before, and that seems like a major thing that the whole timeline discussion was aimed at, was basically saying, that Hex kind of has a weaker jurisdiction argument compared to Pulse and
That is
Pulsex based
true. Yeah.
on the timeline that the SEC presented. And then you'll also remember that there was a comment that the SEC made about Dev Kyle basically giving a statement, signing an affidavit that said something about maybe the Pulse chain or Pulsex sacrifice period was longer than most people realized, and longer than the website had said in all this. And it's interesting that later on the judge said, well, wait a second, can you even say, do you have any proof that Dev Kyle even lives in the US? And the SEC said no to
Yeah, I
that.
thought that
And
was
so she
fantastic,
was
wasn't
like,
it? Like
yeah. So she she was like, well, then how can we include that if this is about jurisdiction at this point?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I don't think she was super impressed with the Deb Kyle affidavit. And I really didn't think it hurt Richard when I first read it. I didn't think there was much in it that the SEC could use. That, in my opinion, that was a very weak piece of evidence that the SEC wanted to use to support their argument, because it really doesn't say much. Like, guy just volunteered his time. He didn't really have much information to provide. He was guessing at things sometimes, which is, I mean, probably because he didn't know. I mean, and that's okay. I don't
It-
really think I
yeah.
don't think he hurt Richard in any way. Um, so, and I don't think the
The
judge put
way
a
that they
lot
were
into
trying
it.
to use the way that they were trying to use his many statements was, I think, simply on the fact that he identified maybe on chain that that basically that maybe there were still sacrifices happening later on, even when the website said the sacrifice is over. But then, yeah, it still goes back to all these other issues that have to all line up, even to include that. And yes, so I think that
Yeah, I think Richard's team did a great, job of understanding that and trying to get the judge to understand that too. It's like it's not like you can shut down an address, on a you can't shut down a 0x address, right? So the Pulse chain sacrifice address, I mean, if I wanted to right now, I could send Pulse to it right now. Or I could send Ethereum to it right now or whatever. I'm not going to because it's freaking retarded. But like you can't stop somebody, even after the day where you say don't send anything else here, you can't stop somebody from sending something else there. It's like,
yeah,
so you can't.
Richard's lawyers compared
How are you
it.
supposed to hold Richard
Yeah, they
accountable?
compared it exactly, and they compared it to the court Dropbox
I thought that was
mailbox.
actually really pretty good because there's a court. I don't know if people know this, but there's a night drop box at every courthouse, or at least all the ones that I ever used to work at, where you can drop off pleadings, like and you basically they stamp them, and they self stamp, and then you throw them in the box, and then the court gets them the next day, and they know when you dropped it off. I can take my, a napkin out of this restaurant I'm in and stamp it and throw it in the court drop box, and it's not going to mean anything, but like I can do it right now. You can't stop me from doing it. So
You could write 12
I
words,
could.
and you could put some hex on it, and you could drop it in the Dropbox to the
It's
court,
exactly right.
and they wouldn't be able to stop
That's
that.
exactly right.
And so,
I do not
yeah.
recommend doing that because if they find you abusing the court box, it's probably some felony or something like that. So don't do it.
Oh, totally.
But
Yeah, I would not do that
yeah,
either. Yeah, and please don't.
it is
Uh,
something that's commonly done with lawyers. I mean, when courts close at 5 p.m. and sometimes you don't get done working on something until 6 7, and you just drop it off at the courthouse before you go home. Happens every day.
I remember the specific angle that I wanted to point out with Dev Kyle is the only reason that they were bringing up that he was the only one that they could find that says that maybe the sacrifice happened for longer than it obviously did, is because they were relying on like three main speaking events that Richard had done, and really trying hard to, like, scrape it, just like, one or two sentences that he had said out of, hours of
That's right.
speaking, and basically to try to say, well, Dev Kyle said that the sacrifice was still going on, and Richard made some, like, some kind of weak statement about, like, oh yeah, like, this could be something, this could be a great thing in the future or something, and it's
Well, yeah, two points.
but yeah.
2 points really quick.
Please.
They used Dev Kyle's statement because they didn't have anything better. That's one thing everybody should realize. And the second thing about it was this has to do with whether or not statements were made during an offering period, right? If the offering period for the sacrifice ended in August of 21, which it did, and Richard put up on his screen on the website, the sacrifice phase has ended, don't send any more shit here, blah blah blah. And yet people still did for whatever the hell reason they wanted to. But I mean, it could have been the SEC sending it at that point, right, in order to establish jurisdiction. But I mean, I'm just saying, it's just but the reason why they had to make the claim, the SEC had to make the claim that the offering period extended to April of 2022 was because Richard made statements in March of 2022 that they wanted to be able to use against him. But again, this relies on the fact that this relies on the judge basically ignoring the fact that Richard put up on on his website that the sacrifice phase for Pulsechain had ended, and then the sacrifice phase for Pulsex had ended. And I thought that was made pretty clear. They're trying to extend jurisdiction, and there was no evidence that there's no evidence that they kept saying it was unofficially extended, the sacrifice period, but there's no evidence that it was. They didn't bring any of that evidence with them, and the only person they could find that would said anything similar to that was Dev Kyle, and I bet you nobody else would have supported that theory, so they went with what they had, and I thought it was weak, and it still is,
Right.
but
Yeah. And the other point you wanted to make?
oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, those were both of them. The first one was that they used Dev Kyle's statements because they had nobody better. That's the only thing they could find that supported their position, because that affidavit was, in my opinion, very weak and didn't do them a lot of good. So if they had somebody better, they would have used somebody better. But that's all they had to go with. So that's how they had to rely on.
What did you think of like this moment where the judge was trying to like figure out, after Richard's lawyers had explained what a sacrifice was, and like she was following that, but then she was asking, why would people send money to an address? Why would people sacrifice for free speech?
Yeah,
What did you think of that
that
moment?
was probably the best part of the SEC's argument, is the judge asking the question, well, why the hell would somebody give this dude $1 billion? Why? If you're not expecting anything back from it, why would you give people $1 billion? And I thought, Mr. Liftik, I thought, did a good job with the American flag analogy. He's like, sometimes you sacrifice your own property to make a personal statement. Like if you own an American flag and you burn it to make a political statement, you just destroyed your own property and you're not expecting anything back from it. It's an interesting argument. I don't know that they have a whole lot of better arguments in this particular case. And it really does seem weird that, a whole bunch of people would give, a bunch of money to a sacrifice address and not knowing whether or not they were going to get anything back. But I mean, the facts are the facts. That's what happened. I mean, Richard, you couldn't sue him for fraud if he never delivered Pulsechain, right? Because he was under no obligation to do so technically. I mean, I guess they could still try and sue him for fraud, but like, I thought the judge's understanding that yes, he even if you take the expectations of people, like, were that he was going to deliver a chain, well, he delivered a chain. That's
Yeah, I think she said something about like promise versus fruition. I
yes,
have that
yes,
written down.
yeah,
And so Pulse Chain did come to fruition. And so where's the fraud?
right.
Where's the lie at this jurisdiction level, right? There was no arguments made to the deeper kind of securities questions that of fraud that were not related to jurisdiction today.
Yeah, they got to, again, this is a pass fail test. Jurisdiction is a pass fail test, and you have to get through there. You have to get over that hurdle in order to continue on with the case. So, we'll see which if any claims survive. I thought it was, I don't ever make predictions on court things because I'd be a hell of a lot richer if I could do so. But most motions to dismiss are kind of junk, and they're usually dismissed. They're usually denied. There's some real teeth in this one, and I think based on some of the judge's questions, this is a pretty close call. I don't know how it's going to go, but I like the arguments that were made today. I like the arguments that the court asked people to make today. I thought she was very well prepared. She's got a good understanding of what's going on. I just can't tell what she's going to hang her hat on. So it could be any number of ways that this thing goes. But a
Yeah.
partial dismissal is good. A full dismissal is even better. But if you narrow down the issues, it helps everybody.
Just to throw out a few more topics that can be discussed, and by the way, I know you're doing several interviews, and I encourage people to check out all of them because I know I will myself. And I'm really excited to say that I heard a lot of different people are going to be streaming about this.
Fantastic.
So I want people to understand. I want people to understand that I'm not the only source. You're not the only source. There were so many amazing people there today that I hope all will comment on all this. Some of the other issues that I think can be discussed that maybe we didn't even have time to get to in our discussion. There's this idea that like there was diamond money, right? There were luxury cars bought and stuff, and the question of whether that was fraud or not, the judge was asking, is this, or the SEC was asking, is this an omission that occurred because people didn't know people didn't know ahead of time when they were sacrificing that some of their some of the money, not their money, but the money, that it could possibly go to buy the world's largest black diamond. And it seems like Richard's team and the judge herself were putting together the pieces of like, oh, wait a second, this is on chain. It's public.
Right.
Even if there's a mixer being used, you know that it's going into a mixer.
Right.
And so that's not fraud.
Yeah, I think the public nature of blockchain really helps at this point. And again, I thought the judge's question was interesting when she was diving into this and said something along the lines of, well, basically, who cares? Like, why doesn't he have a right to some of that money? Like, why can't he pay himself? And I thought that was an interesting way to go. Like, it's not like he took it and then didn't deliver a product. He took it and delivered a product. I mean, just because I don't think that, if you invest in any business, if you overcapitalize the business, is that a problem when the CEO gets paid, more because the business has more money? I don't think that's a problem, and I think she understands that, and I thought that was an interesting line of questioning by her.
Yeah, and then there was also an kind of like an idea that a sacrifice, it's irrevocable, and so that kind of means that there's no expectation. And I've personally made that argument a lot, that when you send your funds somewhere, you can't have expectations because they're not your funds anymore, and that's provable on the blockchain, and that's how blockchains work. And then there was also but I would say that the transaction finality, like property of crypto, the judge was using the word basically it being irrevocable. And then there was also an interesting like argument made by Richard's team about how you didn't even need to get into Howie to see that there was no contract in this case. And Hex being a finished product meant that it's different than other cases in the past where the SEC so easily applied Howie.
Right, and in Telegram and other cases that were brought up today, there were promises to deliver, a blockchain and things like that. When Richard launched Hex, it was a completed product, and I think that's going to differentiate, a lot of that does make a difference, and I hope it resonated with the judge. I think like I said, she really did understand the issues, and it's. I mean, what else can you ask for but a judge that shows up prepared, understands the issues, and asks the right questions? I mean, what else can you ask for?
I was so impressed, and it was so amazing to be here and to witness this alongside of you and all the other community members that showed up. And
Yeah,
so
well, I'd
again,
I'd like to personally thank everybody who showed up to this thing. I know there were people that wanted to show up and couldn't, but I mean, thanks to Nico from Canada who showed up. Hex Rockstar came all the way from England, I think. There were I know Zenith flew in from what is it, wherever the hell he lives, out in the west side or west. RG was here. Just thanks to everybody who spent the time and effort. I mean, Crypto Coffee came in from Puerto Rico. Like, just thanks to everybody who understood the importance of this and showed up and really made our presence felt. And everybody acted professionally. Everybody did the right thing. Everybody was dressed well. It was just, I think we really showed ourselves well. And that can only help.
today made me extremely proud to be in the Hex community
Oh, for
and
sure.
to be a
For
part
sure.
of
Yeah,
something in crypto that's not happening anywhere else.
for sure.
I just wanted to say thanks for all you guys went out there. You guys are the legends that went out there. So you guys made me proud. Nobody's went as clown suits or anything like that. So that's great. And hopefully this things get dismissed. I know you probably don't want to give percentages, but what is your percentage that it just gets dismissed or partial dismissed?
I
I'll play.
I
Yeah,
got nothing to guess on there, but like I will say that this is a much closer call than I think this. I told a couple people outside the courtroom, and I'm like, if I was a judge's clerk here today, and the judge said, "Give me, go write an opinion that supports the, a ruling in front of, in favor of the SEC," I could probably do it. If she said, "Give me an opinion or go draft an opinion that is in favor of Richard," I could definitely do it. I just it's going to take a little while to hammer out the details of whether or not one, each specific issue is going to survive. But I don't think that Richard's team could have done a better job than they did today. It was just fantastic all the way around. He got all of his money worth and then some.
I'll just weigh in really quickly. When I was going into the court room today, I was thinking that the best case scenario was 50-50 for this getting thrown out. And now coming out of the courtroom, I would say for Pulse and Pulsex, the worst case scenario is a 50-50 chance. And for Hex, I think there's a 75% chance in my mind in the best case scenario that Hex alone gets dismissed. So
Yeah,
yeah.
there were timeline issues with respect to Hex that didn't exist necessarily with Pulse and Pulsex. So, Hex would be the lowest hanging fruit on the tree if you wanted to grab it.
So you guys, so you're saying Hex is probably an easier one to get dismissed. Let's just say not even dismissed. Let's just say it goes to trial. Do you think that it's still pretty much it's going to be the SEC is going to get decimated in court? Is that it? Sounds
Yeah,
like that's what you guys are all talking about.
this case is never going to trial. Never. This case is a summary judgment motion case at worst. If it gets past the dismissal stage right now, it'll go through discovery. The parties will both file cross motions for summary judgment, and it'll be decided on that. So, and that that's probably, the court put out a scheduling order earlier this year. So I think we're looking at Q3, Q4 next year for summary judgment motions, if this case proceeds. And there are
Okay.
two very solid things that the judge can hang her hat on, that could end it right now. It just depends on how convinced she is on the jurisdiction issue.
All right. So you're saying third quarter 2025, fourth quarter 2025 is probably at the very latest that we're going to get anything. And that's my last question. Thank you, Maddie. Thank you, Nuclear Herbs. Everybody else that went there. Thank you guys. I'll go down and you guys can answer the question.
Yeah, I mean that seems to be our worst case timeline right now. Our best case timeline is we get an answer in 60 days and we're all just popping champagne.
I mean, I would be even more optimistic that we might hear, in a week or 4 weeks, or should I say 2 more weeks? Because, I'm not, I'm just like wildly speculating on that most optimistic case is that maybe the judge, heard enough to really grasp things. What's your take on that?
Well, I think the judge knows exactly where she's going to go on at least a couple of the issues at the moment, right now. She probably has to do a little bit more, probably wants to delve into some of the answers she got a little bit more and analyze them. And, with respect to some of the court cases that were cited today, and just see if the parties were right, see how she, does she agree with this side, this way, this reading, this interpretation. And then the reason why it takes, 6 to 8 weeks or so to write an opinion like this is it's got to be bulletproof on appeal. Courts don't write decisions necessarily for the parties; they write them for the appellate court. So that takes time.
Okay.
So
I'm changing my answer from 2 more weeks to 2 more months.
there you go.
And then Money Gang Crypto. Let's get one more question with Nuclear Herbs if he can.
Cool. Hi, Money Gang. How are you?
Yeah, I'm well. How are you, sir? Thanks for
Fantastic.
NYC and doing all the stuff that you're doing. Yeah, it was just a quick one. It's only one question, really. I had seen your notes and your comments, and you had said, yeah, it's normally about 60-day response, like from the judge to find out kind of what's going to happen, how it proceeds. But given like Christmas holidays and kind of the nature of courts and things of that nature, would that technically put us past, like towards January period, because that was kind of going through my head. I was adding up days. I was thinking, okay, that's the end of December, but then you make probably adjustments for courts being closed and stuff like that, or you know, the holiday season.
Yeah, it's true. There, I mean, there are things that impact it. I mean, there's always, there's always something that could impact that timeline. I just try to give people the middle of the bell curve, which is roughly around the 60-day mark. I would be pleasantly surprised if it came out before Christmas. I would also not be surprised one bit if it didn't come out until the first, second week of January. So
Cool. Yeah, that was it. Thanks, guys.
you're welcome.